which is the unanswerable objection against those who maintain that Sanskrit was a late artificial product and never was a spoken language, and at the same time the growing stability of the same, with the proscription of all new formations. As in all polite languages, the speakers, who prided themselves on the correctness of their speech, sought for norms which should ensure them correct principles of speaking, and this on the one hand led to the stationary nature of the Sanskrit, since all new formations are, of course, to begin with mistakes. On the other hand, it led to the study of the grammar, which ended in the canonization of the whole grammatical system by Panini, for after which the language became permanently crystallized and no longer showed even a semblance of growth. The above view, then, agrees on the one hand with those who maintain that Sanskrit was in origin not only a living language like any other polite language, but even a vernacular, though only of certain strata of society, but by these it was not learned as an additional language to their own Prakrit vernacular, but it was rather an inheritance from ages long past, while originally, if these persons also spoke Prakrit, it was the latter that was learned as a second language. On the other hand, in course of time the growing ascendancy of the Prakrits with all except the Otvali may have caused this condition to have been reversed, and at any rate Sanskrit became more and more stereotyped until it may properly be said to have become a dead language. This was, however, an exceedingly gradual development, mainly due to natural causes, though perhaps hastened by Panini's canonization, and it would be impossible to fix upon a single point in time and to say its life ended here even if we were in possession of all the facts of the history of the language. Its development from the Vedic, moreover, was also a natural development, by an ultra-conservative society, it is true, but yet a development from which even sound change was not altogether excluded, as Wackernagle, Locke, St. maintains. For on the one hand he himself mentions the change of E to Y and of U to V, on the other hand he has failed to point out the probability of certain sound changes which do not appear in the spelling, sc. The change of I to E, 3 similarly of O to IO, I with long O to I1 with short A, similarly O to O, and finally the thoroughgoing change of accentuation from the Vedic accent to that of the classical Sanskrit, which is pointed out by Wackernagle himself, Op. Cit. 296f. All of these changes are certainly phonetic changes and point to a living spoken language. If Sanskrit was the only direct lineal descendant of the Vedic and in turn of the original language of the first Aryan settlers of India, it was not necessarily a local dialect. But we should a priori expect that wherever there was an Aryan people in the ascendant we would find the Sanskrit language or some language differing from it only by minor dialectic variations, spoken by the kings and priests with their racial pride in their Aryan blood. It is to be expected that Sanskrit was spoken as a caste language throughout the whole Aryan territory of India. When therefore it is maintained d.g. by MacDonald that there is no doubt that in the 2nd century BC Sanskrit was actually spoken in the whole country called by Sanskrit writers Aryavrata, or land of the Aryans, which lies between the Himalaya and the Vindhya range, the statement is in exact accord with our theory. These statements, however, must not be construed to mean that Sanskrit in the very form in which it occurs in literature was the vernacular of the men of the upper castes in all of the vast territory of Aryavrata. Largely, of course, the same conservatism that kept the language so nearly stationary during such a long period also prevented the development of dialectic peculiarities. But yet there must have been some of them. The actual literary Sanskrit is no doubt related to these different spoken Sanskrit dialects just as any other literary language is related to the popular dialects. One or the other of them, by means of literary, religious, or political ascendancy, became the norm to which the speakers of related dialects everywhere were expected to conform, with the result that it displaced all others, which was all the easier because the dialects displaced were themselves fashionable languages, and not, as e.g. in German, popular dialects, the speakers of which largely had no sympathy with this process of normalization. Moreover, We must bear in mind that the languages displaced could have differed from the language now known as Classical Sanskrit in but a minimal degree, and that it was not the displacing of the real popular dialects of Prakrit by the polite language, which was so different as to nearly exclude mutual intelligibility. While therefore the arguments of Frank I and Rapson II to establish a narrower region as the original home of Sanskrit may be perfectly valid, it must always be borne in mind that they concern only that particular form of the language which appears in literature, but that other closely related almost identical dialects existed in almost all Aryavarta from the beginning. It may have happened occasionally, of course, that the pure Aryan speech in a certain locality died out altogether because of the operating of the same forces which caused the poorer Aryans and the women to give it up. But on the whole, the racial pride of the aristocracy was too strong a factor to let us assume that it died out everywhere except in a narrowly circumscribed locality, from where it then had to start out to reconquer all the territory lost before. It cannot be my object here to discuss anew the question as to the interpretation of the fact that Pali appears in inscriptions before Sanskrit, or what is the explanation of this break in the continuity of development. My only concern is to show that the results of Frank's book Pali and Sanskrit do not necessarily conflict with the above theory. According to Opsit 49, the results of Frank's examination of inscriptions show das Ochspitestens im Jahrhundert v. Chr. Und nach Zeit auf der Verderindischen Halbinsel unterhalb der Himalaya und auf Salon als allgemein landesspiritualischen Bevölkerung genergendwegartet Sanskrit in Erdendeiner Provinz vorhanden war, sondern erst allmählich aufgekommen ist. The emphasis should be on the allgemein. i.e. Sanskrit, as shown above, was indeed never a universal vernacular, but a caste language from the beginning, which explains the fact that the inscriptions, which were meant to be understood by as many people as possible, were originally in Pali. It was but natural, consequently, that the speech of the aristocracy, not understood by enough people to be used in public inscriptions, and also often not the vehicle of literary works, since they, even when they finally appeared, were written in the imported classical Sanskrit, should have completely disappeared to our view for most localities. Finally, when the renewed ascendancy of Brahmanism caused a greater number of persons to understand, if not to speak the Brahmin language, the classical Sanskrit, originating in a certain locality and displacing the polite languages of other localities, made its way not only into the inscriptions of Aryavarta, but to every part of India where Brahmin culture was disseminated.